My bad. I just spilled iced coffee all over my keyboard. Again. Leo, my German Shepherd shadow, merely sighed from his usual spot by my feet. A deep, put-upon sound that only a creature with the patience of a saint and the bladder capacity of a camel could truly master. You'd think after 3 years of him silently judging my every clumsy move, I'd have developed some spatial awareness around beverages. Nope. Today, the sticky casualty was my second iced coffee, and the recipient was the architectural rendering of what was supposed to be my little slice of suburban peace, a 6-foot, dog-proof, Brenda-proof fence. "Don't look so smug," I mumbled at Leo, grabbing a handful of paper towels. He just blinked his soulful brown eyes, the kind that could melt glaciers and guilt-trip you into sharing your last slice of pizza. He knew he was blameless in this particular disaster. This time. The real disaster, the kind that had me mainlining caffeine and sketching defensive fortifications at 7 a.m., had started exactly 1 week ago. 3 minutes. That's all it took for a mundane Tuesday morning to devolve into the kind of suburban absurdity that makes you question the very fabric of reality. I'd just hammered the little "Service Dog on Premises" sign into the soft earth near my walkway, feeling a small surge of hope. Finally, maybe the parade of well-meaning but ultimately disruptive neighbors trying to offer Leo treats would cease. Maybe the delivery drivers wouldn't ring the doorbell and then coo at him for 5 minutes straight while my PTSD did a little tap dance in the background. Leo, bless his steady heart, had been a godsend since the multi-car pileup. The flashing lights, the screams, the smell of gasoline and something else. Something metallic and awful that still clung to the edges of my memory. Nightmares were his cue to nudge me awake, his solid presence a grounding force in the swirling chaos of my mind. During the day, his focused calm was a silent reminder to breathe, to stay present. But explaining all that to the denizens of Maple Creek Estates felt like trying to explain quantum physics to a goldfish. Hence the sign. I'd just admired my handiwork, level-centered, politely informative, when I saw her. Brenda. Across the street, wielding a tape measure like a medieval weapon, she was engaged in some sort of intense negotiation with Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias. Brenda, the self-appointed Grand Inquisitor of all things aesthetically displeasing in our little 3-block kingdom. Her natural habitat was the golf cart she'd christened the Compliance Cruiser, and her prey was anyone whose mailbox was a centimeter off-center or whose holiday decorations dared to linger past January 2nd. I gave her a quick, non-committal wave, the kind you'd give a particularly territorial garden gnome. She just narrowed her eyes at my new sign, a barely perceptible twitch in her perfectly Botoxed forehead. A bad omen, perhaps, but I was too optimistic, too convinced of the inherent reasonableness of my request. "See, buddy?" I'd said to Leo, who was already settling into his usual sunbeam on the porch. "Problem solved. Now I can actually get some work done without interruption." Famous last words. Barely 3 minutes later, I was back at my computer, trying to wrestle with a particularly uncooperative vector graphic, when I glanced out the window. Brenda was marching across my lawn with the grim determination of a stormtrooper on a mission. Her lips were pursed, her shoulders were set, and in her hand, she clutched something. My signpost. My jaw dropped. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of it, she'd reached the meticulously placed sign, gripped the metal post with surprising strength, and yanked it out of the ground like it was a particularly stubborn weed. "Excuse me," I called out, rushing to the front door. I opened it just as she was triumphantly hoisting the sign like a fallen banner. She startled, nearly dropping it, then recovered with the speed and grace of a seasoned suburban dictator. "Alexander," she declared, her voice tight with disapproval, "this is an unapproved fixture. All exterior modifications must be submitted in writing to the Architectural Review Committee, per Section C, Paragraph 4 of the bylaws. It's a sign, Brenda, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Leo had followed me to the door and sat calmly at my side, his ears perked, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. A small, polite sign to inform people that he's working medical equipment. Brenda scoffed, a sound like air escaping a punctured pool float. Medical equipment? It's a dog, and this sign is a blight. It lowers the curb appeal. She punctuated her statement with a dismissive wave at the pristine cookie-cutter houses lining our street. He's a federally protected service animal, I countered, stepping onto the porch. And that sign is private property. Please put it back. Don't you take that tone with me, she snapped, her face reddening. I am the president of this homeowners association. This sign is in violation. She held the sign aloft, as if daring me to try and take it. Okay, I said, pulling out my phone. Two can play at this game. I hit record. Brenda, for the record, could you state your name and confirm you are knowingly removing a sign related to a disabled person's service animal? Her eyes flickered with a moment of panic, but she quickly doubled down, her voice rising in volume and dramatic flair. You are harassing me. This is harassment. This man is threatening me with his vicious animal. She took a theatrical step back, as if Leo, who was currently attempting to subtly scratch behind his ear with his hind leg, posed an imminent threat. Vicious animal? My internal monologue was already kicking into high gear, my primary defense mechanism against the sheer absurdity of the situation. He's more likely to lick you to death with enthusiasm than attack you. The only thing in danger right now is my blood pressure. Brenda, meanwhile, had whipped out her own phone, her voice a shrill, escalating whine. I'm calling 911. There's an aggressive man and his attack dog threatening me. He's out of control. She was practically screaming into the receiver, putting on a performance worthy of a community theater production of Psycho. I just stood there, phone still recording, a look of profound disbelief plastered across my face. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some sort of elaborate, caffeine withdrawal-induced hallucination. And then it did. A police cruiser, a black SUV with the unmistakable silhouette of a caged K9 unit in the back, screeched around the corner, its lights flashing. Not for her call, apparently. It was already in the area, responding to a reported break-in, a street over that had turned out to be a squirrel convention in someone's attic. But seeing Brenda's Oscar-worthy performance on my lawn, it pulled right up to the curb. A stern-looking officer, his name tag reading Miller, got out of the driver's side. The German Shepherd in the back, a magnificent creature with alert eyes, barked once, a deep, professional woof that seemed to cut through Brenda's histrionics like a hot knife through butter. Ma'am, Officer Miller said, his voice calm and authoritative, turning his attention to Brenda. What's the situation here? Brenda pointed a trembling finger at me, her face a mask of righteous indignation. Thank God you're here, officer. This man threatened me. His dog is dangerous. Officer Miller's gaze flicked from Brenda's frantic demeanor to me, standing calmly on my porch with Leo sitting perfectly at my heel, looking for all the world like he was waiting patiently for a treat. Then, his eyes landed on Leo's vest. The bright, clearly visible, service dog lettering. The calm, focused demeanor of the animal. His entire expression shifted from responding to a domestic dispute to dealing with a special kind of suburban crazy. And there it is, my internal monologue declared triumphantly. The exact moment the universe decided to pay my karmic invoice in full. She called the cops about my vicious dog and managed to summon the one cop in the county whose partner is also a vicious dog. Officer Miller completely ignored Brenda's continued ranting. He walked towards me and Leo, a slight smile playing on his lips. He's a handsome fella, he said, nodding at Leo. "Shepard. Looks well trained." "He is," I replied, a grin spreading across my own face, despite myself. "Best partner I've ever had." Brenda stood there, mouth agape, still clutching my pilfered sign like a particularly offensive weapon. The K9 in the back of the police SUV let out another sharp bark, as if to punctuate my statement. The sign was back in its place within the hour, courtesy of a surprisingly understanding Officer Miller. He'd even given Brenda a rather pointed lecture on the misuse of emergency services and the federal protections afforded to service animals under the Americans with Disabilities Act. He hadn't cited her, but the icy tone of his voice suggested a formal report would be filed. She'd stood there, radiating a silent, incandescent rage, her face a study in thwarted tyranny. For a week, I allowed myself a small measure of peace. I'd even started sketching plans for a much-needed privacy fence for the backyard. Leo deserved a safe space to decompress, a place where he could be just a dog without the added responsibility of keeping my anxiety in check. The fence, I reasoned, would also serve as a Brenda-proof barrier, a fortress of solitude against suburban overreach. Then the envelope arrived, thick, official-looking, bearing the dreaded Maple Creek Estates HOA logo. Inside, nestled amongst layers of officious-looking paper, were 3 items that effectively torpedoed my newfound sense of tranquility. First, a $100 fine for the unapproved signage, citing the very bylaw Brenda had initially invoked. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. Second, a formal written warning regarding aggressive animals on my property, referencing a non-existent section of the HOA regulations and vaguely alluding to disturbing the peace. Leo, who was currently snoring softly at my feet, was apparently a menace to society. Third, the pièce de résistance, the official rejection of my fence proposal. The Architectural Review Committee, composed entirely of Brenda and her 2 most sycophantic neighbors, had deemed my 6-foot privacy fence proposal to be aesthetically incongruous with the harmonious visual landscape of Maple Creek Estates. Aesthetic incongruity? My internal monologue roared. We all live in identical beige boxes with perfectly manicured, soul-crushingly uniform lawns. The only thing incongruous here is the sheer, unadulterated spite fueling this decision. The sign was one thing, petty, annoying, but ultimately manageable. But the fence was different. It wasn't about curb appeal or bylaws. It was about Leo's well-being, about creating a sanctuary for both of us. It was no longer just about winning a minor skirmish with a power-mad HOA president. This had become a full-blown suburban war. And I, a mildly grumpy graphic designer with a slightly neurotic German shepherd, was apparently on the front lines. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I needed backup. I needed someone who understood the dark arts of bureaucratic warfare, someone who wasn't intimidated by Brenda's iron fist of aesthetic tyranny. I needed a professional. My initial calls to fencing contractors were disheartening. The moment I mentioned HOA denial, most of them developed sudden and urgent appointments elsewhere. It seemed Brenda's reputation for relentless obstructionism preceded her. Then I found him. Big Dave's Fencing and Fortifications. The name alone resonated with a certain rebellious spirit. I dialed the number, bracing myself for another polite refusal. "Big Dave's, Dave speaking," a voice boomed on the other end, a gravelly rumble that sounded like a Harley-Davidson idling. I explained my situation, the sign incident, the denied fence proposal, the looming threat of further HOA harassment. There was a brief silence on the other end, then a low chuckle. "A Brenda, huh? Yeah, I know the type. They run on prune juice and the tears of their neighbors. Don't you worry, son. I've tangled with more HOAs than you've had hot dinners. The trick ain't to fight 'em head on. You gotta use their own stinkin' rule book against 'em." Hope flickered within me. "So, you think you can help?" "Help? Kid, I'm gonna make this Brenda wish she'd stuck to complaining about mismatched recycling bins. I'll swing by tomorrow morning, take a look at the lay of the land. We'll figure something out." Big Dave arrived in a battered Ford F-250 that looked like it had survived a demolition derby. He was a mountain of a man, with a walrus mustache that could rival a small badger and hands the size of dinner plates. He exuded an aura of quiet competence and a distinct whiff of cheerful anarchy. He surveyed my property, the neighboring houses, and finally the spot where I envisioned my fortress of solitude. He listened intently as I recounted the saga of the sign and the injustice of the fence denial. Then, he pulled out the HOA letter and began to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Aesthetic incongruity," he grumbled, spitting out the words like they tasted bad. "What in the Sam Hill does that even mean? Everything here looks the same." "That's what I said," I exclaimed, feeling a surge of validation. Dave spent the next hour dissecting the Maple Creek Estates CC and ours with the focused intensity of a forensic accountant. He highlighted clauses, made notes in the margins with a stubby pencil, and occasionally let out a low whistle of disbelief. "Looky here," he said, pointing to a section buried deep within the document. "Fences for safety and security. Different approval process altogether. Much more lenient. And then there's this bit about reasonable accommodations for folks with disabilities. They can't just ignore federal law, no matter how many beige houses they gotta protect." A plan began to form. It wasn't about privacy, not officially anyway. It was about safety, security, a canine-assisted therapy secure perimeter. It sounded suitably official, suitably bureaucratic, and hopefully suitably Brenda-proof. Dave, it turned out, had a soft spot for dogs, especially working dogs, and a healthy disdain for what he called suburban mafias. He agreed to take on my case, not just as a job, but as a personal mission. His standard fee, plus a case of good IPA if we managed to make Brenda cry. It was a deal I couldn't refuse. That evening, Dave and I huddled over the CC and ours, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a shared sense of righteous indignation. He pointed out vague language, contradictory clauses, and sections that seemed to directly contradict state and federal regulations. "This whole thing is a house of cards," he declared, tapping a thick section with his massive finger. "Built on the shaky foundation of Brenda's ego and a bunch of outdated rules written by people who probably spent more time worrying about lawn ornaments than actual community." Watching Big Dave dismantle these bylaws was like watching a master strategist plot the downfall of an empire, I thought. He has a gleam in his eye that speaks of years spent navigating the absurdities of local ordinances and the stubbornness of petty tyrants. I haven't just hired a contractor, I've hired a legal commando. The revised fence proposal, carefully crafted with Dave's input, emphasized the safety and security aspects, highlighting Leo's role as a service animal and the need for a secure environment for his therapeutic duties. We even included a letter from my therapist, carefully worded to underscore the medical necessity of the fence. While Dave navigated the bureaucratic labyrinth of resubmitting the proposal and dealing with the city permits, I decided to engage in a little guerrilla warfare of my own. I started talking to my neighbors, keeping my tone polite and factual, explaining the situation with Leo and the HOA's unreasonable obstructionism. The neighborhood, I quickly discovered, was a microcosm of suburban society. A few staunch Brenda loyalists who likely feared her more than they feared a zombie apocalypse. A vast majority of neutrals who just wanted to mow their lawns in peace and avoid any conflict. And a small but vocal resistance who had suffered under Brenda's reign of beige terror for far too long. My key ally emerged from the most unexpected corner, Margaret, my elderly next-door neighbor. She seemed like your typical sweet, slightly dotty grandmother, always offering cookies and asking about my day. But beneath the gentle exterior lurked a seasoned veteran of the Brenda Wars. "Oh, dearie," she'd said, her eyes twinkling with mischief as she handed me a plate of slightly burnt but undeniably heartfelt chocolate chip cookies. "Brenda's been on a power trip since they practically strong-armed everyone into electing her. Tried to find me last year because my petunias were, and I quote, an aggressive shade of pink. I've been waiting for someone like you to come along and shake things up. Margaret became my informant, my strategist, my secret weapon. She knew who in the neighborhood harbored secret resentments against Brenda, who had received spurious violation notices, who had been forced to repaint their mailbox to an approved shade of off-white. She even started a campaign of subtle sabotage, accidentally leaving printouts of the Americans with Disabilities Act regulations on the community mailbox bulletin board, right next to Brenda's meticulously typed notices about lawn maintenance. Inspired by Big Dave's cynical wisdom and Margaret's quiet rebellion, I embarked on my own campaign of malicious compliance. I started following every single HOA rule to the absolute letter. In the most pedantic and infuriating way imaginable, I submitted a formal, 3-page request to change a burnt-out porch light bulb, complete with detailed schematics of the existing fixture, the proposed replacement, and a comprehensive environmental impact statement analyzing the difference in wattage. I filed a formal complaint, with photographic evidence, that Brenda's compliance cruiser golf cart was frequently parked on a blade of grass while she conducted her patrols, a clear violation of Section G, Paragraph 5, Subsection B of the bylaws. I submitted a written request for a full accounting of the HOA's financial records at the next general meeting, citing my rights as a member and expressing concerns regarding recent expenditures. I am weaponizing bureaucracy, I thought. A grimly satisfied smile spreading across my face as I meticulously documented Brenda's every minor infraction. It feels petty. It feels ridiculous. But by God, it feels effective. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a depressing room with bad fluorescent lighting and the faint aroma of stale cookies and simmering resentment. Brenda presided at the head of a long table, flanked by her 2 loyalists, their expressions stern and self-important. The agenda was a litany of minor violations, each one presented by Brenda with the solemnity of a prosecutor reading an indictment. Then came the main event, my resubmitted fence proposal. Brenda presented the Architectural Review Committee's predictably negative recommendation, painting me as a disruptive element trying to introduce an eyesore that would shatter the neighborhood's harmonious aesthetic and lower property values. She even suggested, with a dramatic shudder, that a 6-foot fence would attract undesirable elements. It was my turn. I stood up, feeling a nervous flutter in my stomach, but also a surge of determination. I had Big Dave's coaching echoing in my ears. Keep it calm, keep it factual, and for the love of all that is holy, mention the ADA. I didn't talk about privacy. I talked about safety. I talked about security. I used the phrase reasonable accommodation so many times it started to sound like a mantra. I presented the letter from my therapist, highlighting the medical necessity of a secure environment for Leo's therapeutic work. I had copies of the relevant ADA guidelines for anyone who wanted to dispute the federal law. "This is not a prison, Alexander," Brenda declared, her voice tight with indignation. "We will not have 6-foot security fences turning our beautiful neighborhood into a compound." "Actually, Brenda," I said calmly, referring to my meticulously annotated copy of the CC and Rs. "According to Section F, Paragraph 2, which you yourself cited in your initial denial, it states that fences are limited to 4 feet, unless required for security or safety. And according to federal law," I held up the ADA document, "this is a required accommodation. The fence provides a secure area for my service animal to perform his duties without interference from the public, which is critical for my ongoing therapy. The room erupted. The Brenda loyalists gasped, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. The resistance, led by Margaret, murmured their support, some even daring to nod in my direction. Big Dave, sitting in the back row with a grin that stretched from ear to ear, gave me a subtle thumbs up. Brenda, flustered and visibly losing control of the narrative, made a fatal error. "I don't care what some federal law says," she sputtered, her voice rising to a near shout. "This is Maple Creek Estates, and my rules are the law here." A stunned silence fell over the clubhouse. Even the Brenda loyalists looked uncomfortable. She had just admitted, in front of 24 witnesses, to knowingly disregarding federal law. The implications hung heavy in the air. My fence proposal didn't get an immediate approval, but the shift in the room was palpable. The aura of Brenda's absolute authority had cracked, revealing the petty tyrant underneath. As I walked out of the meeting, feeling a lightness I hadn't experienced in weeks, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Big Dave. "Phase 1 complete. Now we get that permit from the city. Even Queen Brenda can't stop that. Get ready to build." True to his word, Big Dave, with his uncanny ability to navigate bureaucratic red tape, secured the necessary building permit within days. The city inspector, a no-nonsense woman who clearly had no patience for suburban drama, reviewed our plans and declared them fully compliant with all local codes. Construction was scheduled to begin in exactly 1 week. The permit, a small, unassuming piece of paper bearing the official city seal, became a symbol of hope. I taped it to my refrigerator, right next to a slightly lopsided drawing of a bone that Leo had created at a charity event. It was, I decided, the most beautiful document I had ever seen. A Declaration of Independence written on municipal letterhead. 2 days before the scheduled construction, another official-looking envelope arrived. This one was from a law firm. Brenda, using HOA funds, as Margaret later confirmed through her network of disgruntled neighbors, had hired legal muscle. They had filed for an emergency injunction, claiming my fence violated a historical covenant from the 1970s regarding unobstructed sightlines that was supposedly grandfathered into the current regulations. It was a ludicrous argument based on a vague clause about not impeding views of the common areas, which, in my case, amounted to a stretch of identical beige siding, but it was enough to potentially halt construction and drag me into a costly legal battle I couldn't afford. Despair washed over me. It felt like Brenda had anticipated our every move, that she held a trump card I couldn't possibly counter. The thought of months, possibly years, of legal wrangling, of draining my savings to fight her petty vendetta was crushing. "She's using our own HOA dues to sue me," I said to Dave over the phone, my voice thick with frustration. "It's diabolical." There was a pause on the other end. Then Dave's rumbling voice, surprisingly calm, cut through my anxiety. "Don't you fold, kid. This is her last desperate play. Bullies like her always leave a trail. Let me make a few calls. We just need to find the right person who's had enough of her nonsense." Construction day dawned bright and clear. Despite the looming legal threat, Big Dave's truck was parked in my driveway before 7 a.m., his 2-man crew unloading stacks of sturdy cedar fencing. Dave, ever the pragmatist, had decided to call Brenda's bluff. We had a valid permit. We were proceeding. "They can file all the paperwork they want," he'd said with a shrug. "Doesn't mean a judge has signed anything yet. We build until someone with a badge and a court order tells us to stop." We were barely an hour into digging the post holes when Brenda appeared, like a vengeful spirit summoned by the sound of a power auger. She was flanked by her perpetually silent husband, Gary, and Mrs. Higgins, one of her most devoted loyalists, both looking suitably grim. Brenda clutched a sheaf of papers in her hand, the lawyer's letter prominently displayed on top. "Cease and desist," she shrieked, her voice echoing down the quiet street. "You are in violation of a legal order! I'm calling the police!" Big Dave, unfazed, continued to operate the auger, the loud whir a deliberate act of defiance. "This here's just a filing, Brenda," he yelled over the noise. "No judge has signed nothing. We got a permit. Now if you'll excuse us, we got post holes to dig." Brenda's face contorted with rage. She stepped directly into the path of the auger, forcing Dave to stop. "You will not destroy this neighborhood's aesthetic!" she shrieked, her voice reaching a fever pitch. That's when the cavalry started to arrive. Margaret emerged from her house carrying a large pitcher of lemonade and a tray of glasses for the work crew, pointedly ignoring Brenda's outburst. Other members of the neighborhood's quiet resistance began to appear, setting up lawn chairs on their own properties to watch the unfolding drama. It was becoming a spectator sport, the pent-up frustration of years of HOA tyranny finally finding an outlet. And then, the truly unexpected happened. Officer Miller, bless his observant soul, jogged into view, his off-duty attire a stark contrast to the crisp uniform I'd seen him in before. His own dog, a friendly-looking Labrador, trotted happily at his side. He slowed as he took in the scene. Brenda's histrionics, Big Dave's stoic defiance, the growing crowd of onlookers, a look of professional curiosity on his face. Brenda, fueled by a potent cocktail of anger and desperation, turned her attention to Big Dave. "You are a menace!" she shrieked, jabbing a finger in his chest. "I'll have your business license revoked. I'll sue you personally." She was practically spitting with fury. Big Dave, a human redwood in the face of her tantrum, remained unmoved. In a moment of utter irrationality, Brenda shoved him. It was a weak, almost comical shove, but it was still assault. And that's when Margaret's nephew, a quiet accountant named Kevin who lived with her and rarely spoke, cleared his throat from his porch. "Excuse me, Mrs. Henderson? I just finished my review of the HOA's financial records you were required to provide at the last meeting. Perhaps you could explain why there appear to be several rather unusual expenditures, such as a $2,000 charge for a HOA retreat to the Bahamas last April, and several payments to a law firm that don't seem to be related to any official HOA business." A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of the auger. Brenda's face, already red with anger, paled visibly. The air crackled with the sudden, electrifying revelation of her alleged financial impropriety. Her loyalist neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, suddenly found an urgent need to examine her prize-winning roses. Gary, as always, just stared blankly at the ground. Officer Miller, his casual jog clearly forgotten, strolled over to Brenda, his expression now decidedly less curious and more official. "Brenda," he said calmly, "I think we need to have a chat. Let's step over here, away from the construction." Brenda's carefully constructed facade of suburban authority finally crumbled. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes welled up, and for the first time she looked genuinely defeated. The fence went up. It was beautiful, sturdy cedar providing the perfect blend of privacy and security. Leo, unleashed in his new domain, ran and leaped with unrestrained joy, a furry blur of pure happiness. I sat on my back porch, a cold beer in hand, watching him, a sense of peace settling over me that had been absent for far too long. The emergency HOA meeting was a swift and decisive affair. The evidence of Brenda's financial mismanagement, compiled meticulously by Kevin, was irrefutable. She was voted out as president in a landslide. Margaret, much to her initial reluctance, was nominated and elected as the new HOA president. Her first official act was to issue a neighborhood-wide decree declaring petunias of all colors officially welcome. Brenda and Gary put their house on the market a month later. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they'd moved to a gated community with even stricter rules. A place where perhaps Brenda's particular brand of control would be more appreciated. A few months later, life in Maple Creek Estates had settled into a new rhythm. The beige houses still stood in their perfectly aligned rows, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a newfound sense of community forged in the fires of the Brenda Wars. I was in my backyard, throwing a slobbery tennis ball for Leo, the afternoon sun warm on my face. Margaret was tending to her riotously pink petunias next door, their vibrant color a cheerful act of defiance against the neighborhood's former aesthetic overlord. "Morning, Alex," Margaret called out, a smile in her voice. "The new architectural committee approved 3 more fences this week, all for dogs. You started a trend." "Just promoting neighborhood security, Margaret," I replied, tossing the ball again. Leo, a furry missile of enthusiasm, bounded after it. "Maple Creek Estates," my internal monologue mused. "The sign at the entrance still reads a tradition of excellence." But now it feels a little more accurate. We've got a new tradition, a tradition of fences and good dogs, and not letting the Brendas of the world win. And that's a tradition I can definitely get behind. Leo dropped the tennis ball at my feet, his tail thumping against the wooden deck, his eyes full of playful energy. I laughed, reaching down to ruffle his fur. The quiet had returned to Maple Creek, but it was a different kind of quiet now, a better one, the kind that felt earned. And as I threw the ball again, sending Leo racing across the newly fenced yard, I knew that even amidst the beige conformity of suburbia, a little bit of glorious, hilarious rebellion could bloom. 1 6-foot fence at a time.